join others who have mentioned the shocking event today of the shooting of Congressman Steve Scalise, and how much I hope and pray that he makes a full recovery. I'm thinking of him and his family tonight, as I'm sure we all are. It's always a pleasure to be back here in the colonies, ladies and gentlemen. We did think at one point of making this place the capital of the British Empire. We decided again, we were going to move the king over here and everything. We decided against it, which possibly, in retrospect, was a bit of an error of judgment. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and I normally insist on these events of speaking after Ambassador Ron Dermer, who I see is sitting over on table 4, if anyone hasn't clocked him yet. The reason I like to speak after him is because I can then dish out some verbal abuse towards him without fear of revenge. But tonight, unfortunately, he can take revenge. So I'll say something nice about him. He is an incredible man, a phenomenal diplomat, and a fantastic representative of the State of Israel here in the United States. And for me, more than that, I'm very, very honoured to count him and Rhoda as very close friends. I'd also like to say what an honour it is to have served for much of my career alongside members of the United States and the Israeli Armed Forces, intelligence services and police service. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here in this room with those of you who have also served. Thank you very much, EMET, for giving me this phenomenal award. I'm sure I don't deserve it, but I'm deeply grateful for having it bestowed upon me. EMET is a phenomenal organisation, as I'm sure all of you in this room well know. I follow their work very closely, and I use the work that they produce myself a huge amount, and I know many others do as well. They go from strength to strength. Particularly, I'd like to pay tribute to Sarah Stern and the fantastic work she does, as well as all of the other staff members. For those of you who don't speak good Hebrew, EMET means truth. Did you know that? Okay. I can teach you some more Hebrew a bit later on, but EMET means truth, and a fellow countryman of mine, and half fellow countryman of yours, Winston Churchill, said, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." And that thinking became a critical factor in the Allied victory in the Second World War. And indeed, one example of that was Operation Bodyguard, which was a deception operation intended to make the Germans think that the D-Day invasion was going to take place somewhere else apart from Normandy, and indeed that deception operation succeeded. But it was that bodyguard of lies surrounding the truth which I think characterised so many of the successful Allied operations during that war. But if we understand that, so do our enemies. And in the Middle East, lies have become the central pillar of our enemy's strategy against us. A massive effort has gone into covering up the truth, especially the truth about the Israel-Palestine situation. The most recent example of that was the lies that the Palestinian leadership told to President Trump and Secretary Tillerson that today that they plan to stop payments to so-called martyrs, in other words, terrorists. And today, they finally told the truth, or something like it, and admitted they're not going to stop these payments. And part of their objective in that, of course, is to humiliate President Trump and Secretary of State Tillerson. The problem is that so many of our political leaders, human rights organisations, and media cannot recognise this tactic that's being used against us, this tactic of lies. And many, especially in Europe and in the United Nations, don't even recognise that they consider, that our enemies consider themselves to be at war with us. They believe the lies about Israeli war crimes and oppression. They believe the lies about so-called occupation and so-called illegal settlements. They even believe the most preposterous lies that deny the Jewish connection to Jerusalem. They believe the lies about how the Palestinian leadership want peace and a two-state solution. Not because they're stupid, our leaders that is, but because, on the whole, being good people, they cannot recognize, they cannot comprehend the type of mind that prefers war to peace, that would strive for the death of their own people and would drive their own people to ruin. That, in some cases, or in some cases they just want to believe and tell themselves that they do, that this is the reality. That is why EMET is so vitally important to all of us. But even with EMET's spotlight, the truth on its own will get us nowhere at all. As Churchill might have said, the truth must find allies in strength and courage. And one of my earliest lessons in courage, I learned at the age of 14 from a 19-year-old Jew called Simcha Unstorfer. Despite so many horrors, he survived Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and other camps through incredible personal courage, strength of will, the example of his father, and above all, his religious faith. This young man, a frail, bespectacled 19-year-old, entered Auschwitz, was beaten and brutalized in Auschwitz and other camps, and eventually, on a death march towards Buchenwald in 1945, himself almost dying of exhaustion and starvation, dragged along a fellow prisoner who could no longer walk, dragged him for mile after mile through the quagmire to Buchenwald, and eventually the two of them survived. I never met Simcha Unstorfer, but I read the book that he wrote when I was 14 years of age. I've never forgotten it, and that book and his example of courage, which is not untypical of so much courage of Jews who endured the Holocaust, has been an inspiration to me for 40 years and during many military campaigns since the day that I first opened his heart-rending account of extraordinary courage in the face of unexampled savagery. And that kind of courage and strength must be allied to the truth. And that is what, and it's essential that, that we retain that truth and that courage and that strength. And that is what led Israel to defeat a massively superior military force 50 years ago in 1967, that led to the liberation and reunification of the eternal capital of Israel, Jerusalem, 50 years ago. It's also, ladies and gentlemen, that kind of courage that led Britain to conquer the Ottoman Empire and liberate Jerusalem from the Turks 100 years ago, this December, on the first night of Hanukkah, 1917. Incidentally, that was the first example of the first embryonic example of mutual British, American and Israeli cooperation, military cooperation, even though, of course, well before the foundation of the State of Israel, there was an organization called the Jewish Legion, which was part of the British Army, was made up of British, Palestinian and American Jews predominantly, who fought during the Palestine campaign in 1918. And today we continue to see examples of the courage of 1967 whenever Israel is threatened, whether it's from Gaza, from Lebanon, from Syria, or from Sinai. We do not, unfortunately, see the courage of 1917 from my own country, Britain. The weakness of the West is seen day in and day out in the repeated terrorist attacks to which we are subjected in Europe. A total of 8 serious attacks was planned against the UK in the last 2 months. 5 of them were prevented by our security services, undoubtedly with assistance from intelligence services in Israel and the US, undoubtedly. 3 of them, unfortunately, succeeded. And despite these outrages in which dozens of British people were killed and maimed, we still allow Islamic State fighters to return to our country after their orgies of murder, rape and torture in Syria and in Iraq. And even this coming Sunday, we are allowing a march of Hezbollah and Hamas supporters to parade through the streets of London, yelling extremist chants and brandishing jihadist flags to celebrate the so-called Al-Quds Day. 40% of the voters in Britain voted for a party in the last election led by a man whose entire political career has been marked by opposing the British state at every turn, supporting and excusing our enemies, and befriending terror groups like the IRA, Hamas and Hezbollah. This is weakness in Britain, and it is the same weakness that infects the whole of the European Union and most of the United Nations. Not only has the EU weakened itself through fear, guilt and appeasement, it seeks to impose that same weakness on the State of Israel today, accusing it of illegality, demanding concessions, denying Palestinian wrongdoing, and funding Palestinian spreading of hate and terrorism. Again, too often, we do not see the bodyguard of lies that surround the truth of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And even when we do know the truth, we are too weak to stand up against it. This is why I believe that the Israel-Palestine conflict has worn on for so long and threatens to wear on and on without resolution. We do not understand that we have repeatedly shown weakness. Instead of meeting the truth with strength and courage, we have met lies with weakness and fear. We know the truth. We know the Palestinian leadership will not accept any peace with Israel short of outright capitulation. No matter how much they might pretend otherwise, no matter how much they might lie to President Trump or Prime Minister May. We know they want only the destruction of the Jewish state. We know also that Israel cannot withdraw its forces from Judea and Samaria and have a hope of survival. Whatever the true intentions of the Palestinians, a brief look around the Middle East will confirm in the mind of any military man, and I'm sure anyone in this room will agree, that withdrawal would equal suicide. We know, therefore, that there cannot be a two-state solution. Now we have and in that knowledge, we now have to ally our understanding of this truth with courage and strength. For decades, we've tried reasoning with the Palestinians, making concessions, patronizing them. It hasn't worked, and it won't work. They see it as weakness, and weakness provokes them and emboldens them to demand more and give less. We have to try a different approach. They must pay a price for their refusal to compromise and their continued spreading of hate against Israel and the West and the Christian population of their territories. Above all, we must find a way to make the Palestinian leaders pay the price, those in the process of making themselves multimillionaires rather than their hapless, miserable people. No more concessions, no more providing hope for their warlike ways. If we continue to appease and excuse them, we simply encourage them to carry on killing, maiming and provoking war. Israel will, of course, flourish and endure. That is not in question at all. But a hardline approach, putting pressure on both Palestinians and Arab states alike, will ally truth